Australia is a regional bully in the Pacific. It has used climate finance and aid as a means to blackmail Pacific governments from really not stepping up to the ambitions that is needed by Australia by silencing Pacific. There is numerous conditionalities that are actually put on Pacific governments, which in fact weaken environment safeguards and human rights in Pacific countries. And so they're unable to really address their own climate impacts. And so this is what Australia is doing, and they need to be called out.
And for a long time, Australia was able to escape the international scrutiny and criticism that it deserved because it wasn't alone in trying to thwart the ambition of progressive countries and nations like those in the Pacific Islands, which are some of the strongest climate activists. But in past years, there was always this other country. The likes of China or the United States could be blamed, and they shielded Australia from the condemnation its policies and its politics called for. Australian and Pacific leaders have often clashed on the wording of declarations, but I just can't stress enough that there's a lot more than words at stake. And the fossil fuel-driven pollution that Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison has refused to seriously rein in is directly contributing to the cyclones, to the king tides and the rising sea levels that are threatening the very existence of entire nations in the Pacific. So this report, based on the testimony of current and former Pacific leaders, exposes how Australia's aid, nominally for climate adaptation, often has very tenuous or no link to climate whatsoever. This kind of thuggish behavior has not gone unnoticed in the world stage. And the way, if you look at the pictures from the recent G20 meeting, how Scott Morrison ambled aimlessly around with his head down, pretending to play with his phone while surrounded by a host of G20 leaders, well, it just reveals that Scott Morrison is a leader with no friends. Australia's international reputation has taken a battering because of its poor climate policies that represent a blatant disregard for the well-being of its citizens and the very existence of Australia's Pacific neighbors that Morrison cynically calls family.
Australia has doubled down on protecting the fossil fuel industry. The fact that Australian Pavilion here at COP26 is sponsored by Santos, Australia's second largest independent oil and gas producer, which has been allowed to receive carbon credits while being paid to store carbon by the Australian government, is a slap in the face to the very small Pacific delegation that has been able to make its way here to COP26 to fight for the survival of the Pacific communities. So to the Australian government, I say, please do not bastardize this sacred relationship that we have of one soul, one spirit, our connection with land and sea, and don't bastardize it by reducing it to rhetoric. To Australia, I say God is watching. To Australia, I say the Pacific is watching. And to my Christian brothers and sisters in the political leadership of Australia, I call on you to love your neighbor. If you want to use this word Vuvalu, you have to love your neighbor. You have to love the Pacific. In the Christian sense, we talk about love your neighbor with all your heart, your soul, your strength, your mind. In this context of climate change, we say, love your neighbor, don't bully your neighbor. Love your neighbor with real commitments, and love your neighbor with real finance. Renaka, thank you. When I hear these kinds of questions, I want to cry. Because our Pacific people, we need the help. That's the reality. We are very grateful for the assistance in vaccines for COVID. But we know that's vaccine diplomacy. We are very grateful for whatever funds come our way because we are in desperate need of it. But there is so much being spent on other things. That's one. And that this money is shared not just for the Pacific, it's Asia Pacific. So it's being spread so thin. How much impact will that really have? So when you add it all together, that's great. It's 500 million, it's 1.5 billion, but when you actually start dishing it out. And so they're playing on our desperation. But the Pacific leaders, the saddest thing is that the Pacific knows what Australia is doing. But we're in such a vulnerable position that we have no choice. And that's why all we can do is call it out. And we hope that the Australian people are listening. We hope the world is listening, because we are running out of time.